Hello and welcome. This is Жанна Бугибаевна. Today's theme is conditionals or if sentences. If you're ready, let's begin. So we have four types of conditionals. First of all, let's look at the formulation. So in conditional 0, we use a present simple and if clause and present simple again in the consequence clause. Then there is conditional 1, first conditional. We use present simple in the if clause and future simple in the consequence clause. Conditional 2 or second conditional, we use past simple in the if clause and would do in the consequent clause. And final conditional 3 or third conditional, we use past perfect in the if clause and consequent clause is formulated by would have done. Note that if clause can be either the first or the second part of the sentence. So you can switch two clauses round. So let's start with 0 conditional. To remind you of the formulation, if plus present simple, present simple. Looking at the concept of 0 conditional, it is to express a fact, something that is always true. So in this sense, this is not a real conditional. For example, if you heat ice, it melts. If demand for a product rises, its price rises too. It is easier to relax if you close your eyes. Note, for conditional 0, it is also possible to use when instead of if, because it is not a real conditional sentence. For example, we can say when demand the product rises, its price rises too. Let's look at the conditional 1 or first conditional. So formulation, if plus present simple and future simple will do. The concept of the first conditional is a present or future situation of high probability. Note that probability is about the probability of the action in the if clause, not the other clause. So let's look at some examples. I see her quite often. So here's a high probability that I see her tomorrow. If I see her tomorrow, I will speak to her. Another example, they're always late. There is a high probability that we'll be late again. I will not let them in if they're late again. A final example, there can be some changes. There's a high probability of changes. If anything changes, we'll let you know. Moving on to the second conditional. Let me remind you formulation if plus past simple and would do. The concept of second conditional is to do either a present or future situation of low probability or 0 probability, a hypothesis, an unreal situation. Once again, note The probability is about the probability of the action in the if clause, not the other clause. Okay, let's look at some examples. So examples of first case. I don't often see her. So it's not probable to see her tomorrow. But if I saw her tomorrow, I would speak to her. Second example, I don't think anything will change. There is a low probability of change, but if anything changed, we would let you know. Let's look at some examples of zero probability or hypothesis. I don't have any time this week, but I can imagine what I would do. If I had some time, I would tidy up my office, for example. Or I'm not a lawyer. So here's completely unreal situation. If I were a lawyer, I wouldn't take on this case. Note, the correct form of the verb to be to use in conditional to is were for all pronouns. In some cases, was is acceptable, but it is better to keep it to were to ensure you are always correct. Okay, moving on, conditional 3 or third conditional. Let's remind you a formulation. If plus past perfect, would have done. The concept is very clear. A past situation, too late, zero possibility. Examples. I did see her yesterday. If I had seen her, I would have spoken to her. They weren't late last night. I wouldn't have let them in if they had been late. Nothing changed after you left. If anything had changed, we would have let you know. So let's look at some special cases. First one is use of would for politeness. For example, if you follow me, please, I'll show you your room, the first conditional. You can add would to the past and you'd follow me, I'll show you your room. Let's look at another special case. Case of imperatives and requests in conditional 1. For example, if you see John, please give him this book. So you are using an imperative in second clause instead of future simple. Or, could you give John this book, please, if you see him? Here's a request formulated with could you. Or, if you aren't busy, may I see you for a minute? Another request formulated with may I. So, special case where you use may, might, and could. This can be used in a consequent clause to reduce the certainty of the action in that clause. Let's look at some examples in each condition. For example, in conditional 1, the sixth sentence, if I see her tomorrow, I will speak to her. This means there is no doubt that I will speak to her. So look at the sentence, if I see her tomorrow, I may speak to her, or I might speak to her, or I could speak to her. This means there is some doubt that you'll speak to her even if you see her. So we have reduced certainty of the action in the consequence clause. Let's look at another example in second conditional. If they were late again, I would not let them in. It's absolutely sure that I will not let them in. But we can decrease the certainty. If they were late again, I might not let them in. No, it's not possible that we'll not let them in. So let's look at the example in conditional 3. If I had had some time last week, I would have tidied up my office. It's sure that I would have tidied it up. If I had had some time last week, I might have tidied up my office. Or I could have tidied up my office. Now, it's not sure, it's possible that I would have tidied it up. Note 1. Use may only in conditional 1 sentence. Might and could can be used in all 3 real conditionals. And note 2. You should avoid using should instead of will or would in a conditional sentence. For example, don't say, if I knew his name, I should say hello to him. You have to say, I would say hello to him. So let's look at some common mistakes. Common mistake number 1 is using when instead of if in real conditionals 1, 2, and 3. Remember, you can use when instead of if in conditional 0. So examples, conditional 1. When I see her tomorrow, I'll speak to her. Actually, this is a correct sentence, but has a different meaning. It means you are certain you'll see her tomorrow. It's no longer a conditional sentence. Let's look at this example with conditional 2. When it were a little warmer, I would go for a swim. You cannot with when in this sentence. You should use if. If it were a little warmer, I would go for a swim. So conditional 3. When I hadn't had so much coffee, I would have slept better. Once again, we cannot use when in conditional 3. It has to be if. If I hadn't had so much coffee, I would have slept better. Let's look at common mistake 2, using will or would twice, both in the if and consequent clauses. For example, in conditional 1, saying something like, if you will come back tomorrow, I will give it to you then. In this clause, we have to change, if you come back tomorrow, I will give it to you then. Conditional 2. You would miss the bus if you wouldn't leave now. Again, to would, we have such kind of sentence. So, if you would miss the bus if you didn't leave now. Conditional 3. No one would have noticed if you wouldn't have said anything. Once again, to would in the sentence can't be. Wouldn't have changed to hadn't. Past perfect. No one would have noticed if you hadn't said anything. And finally, common mistake number 3, mixing up one conditional with another. For example, conditional 1 and conditional 2. Mistake can be, how much would it be if I pay cash? You can either to change it conditional 1, how much will it be if I pay cash? Or conditional 2, how much will it be if I paid cash? Another example will be mixing up conditional 2 and 3. A mistake can be, if you came earlier, we would have had more time. Again, you can correct it into conditional 2. If you came early, we would have more time. Or conditional 3. If you had come earlier, we would have had more time. So that's all for about conditionals. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. Thank you for your attention. See you next week.